separated by huge oceans, by thousands of years, and by no way they could have ever talked to each other. People in Mesopotamia, ancient Israel, India, Greece, China, and dozens of indigenous cultures in the Americas and Australia all tell some version of the exact same story. A giant flood destroys the world. One family builds a boat and lives. Everyone else drowns.
That's not something you can just shrug off. Today, we're putting these stories side by side and asking, what's really happening? Here's the deal for the next 20 minutes. We're not going to just rattle off flood myths. You've probably already seen that video. We're going to look at 5 specific stories in the order that actually matters. First, the oldest written version we have. Then, the one where we can prove one culture copied from another. Then, and this is the part that will keep you listening, the ones where copying was impossible because those people never had a way to reach each other. Once we have all 5 next to each other, we'll look at the 2 explanations researchers actually take seriously. Not a lost super civilization, not secret worldwide contact. The real, evidence-based answers. And we'll talk straight about the ancient aliens idea because you've almost certainly heard it, and it deserves an honest look instead of a wave of the hand.
The oldest written flood story anyone can date is about 4,000 years old. It comes from Mesopotamia, and it contains a test so specific that it still shows up almost unchanged more than 1,000 years later. Here's how it goes. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Tablet 11, written in Mesopotamia about 4,000 years ago, though it comes from even older stories, a man named Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh how he survived the flood that ended the last age of the world. The god Ea secretly warns him that the other gods have decided to wipe out humans. Ea gives exact instructions. Build a boat to these measurements, seal it with pitch, bring your family, bring skilled workers, bring the seed of every living thing. The flood comes. It lasts 6 days and 7 nights. When it stops, the boat lands on a mountain, Mount Nemush, in what's now Iraqi Kurdistan. Then comes the detail that should make you sit up. Utnapishtim doesn't just peek outside and say the flood is over. He runs a real test. On the 7th day after landing, he lets a dove go. It flies out, finds nowhere to land, and comes back. He lets a swallow go. Same thing. It returns. Finally, he lets a raven go. The raven eats, circles, caws, and never comes back. Only then does Utnapishtim know the water has gone down enough to leave the boat. This story is even older than Gilgamesh in some form. Earlier Mesopotamian texts, the Atrahasis and the Sumerian Ziusudra story, tell almost the same events. So we're not looking at one single myth. We're looking at a story Mesopotamian writers were already retelling and changing for centuries before anyone around the Mediterranean wrote their own version. Now wait, the next version isn't just similar. Scholars can actually prove it was copied, and the copying is more exact than most people realize. The flood of Noah in Genesis follows the same exact pattern. A warning, precise boat-building instructions, a flood that destroys the world, and then again, that bird testing sequence. Noah sends out a raven. Later, he sends a dove 3 times. First, it finds nothing and comes back. Then it returns with an olive branch, and the 3rd time it doesn't come back at all because the ground is dry. Same idea. Let a bird go and watch what it does, more than 1,000 years later. And in this case, scholars who study the Bible aren't arguing about whether contact happened. They mostly agree it did. The Hebrew Bible was put together by people living in the Levant, in repeated contact with Mesopotamia, including a time of Babylonian exile when Judean writers were living right in the culture that already had these older flood stories. This is transmission, a story moving from one written tradition into another,
changed to fit a new set of beliefs. Here, the flood becomes a punishment for wickedness, not just the gods being annoyed. Hold on to that difference. It's our control group. We now know what one culture borrowing this from another actually looks like on the page. Now, watch what happens when that explanation can't work anymore. The next story comes from a completely different part of the world, with a different language and no known contact. And it still has the warning, the boat, and the lone survivor. In Hindu tradition, one of the oldest surviving accounts comes from the Shatapatha Brahmana, a Vedic text written around 800 to 900 BCE. A man named Manu is washing in the morning when a tiny fish slips into his hands and begs for protection. Manu raises the fish. As it grows, it warns him. A flood is coming that will destroy everything. Build a ship. When the water rises, tie your ship's rope to my horn.
Manu does exactly that. The fish tows his ship north through the flood to a mountain. Manu waits it out and becomes the only survivor, and in later versions, the ancestor of a new human race. If you think that's far, wait until we jump across another ocean and another language family. Now we're in Greek myth. Deucalion is warned, in some versions by his father, the Titan Prometheus, that Zeus is going to flood the world to punish humans for being corrupt. Deucalion builds a chest, gets in with his wife Pyrrha, and survives while the flood kills everyone else. When the waters go down, an oracle tells them to throw the bones of their mother behind them as they walk. They're confused at first. Then they realize their mother is the earth itself, and her bones are stones. Every stone Deucalion throws becomes a man. Every stone Pyrrha throws becomes a woman. Humanity starts over from rocks. And now, the one that breaks the copying explanation completely. This next culture had no ship, no trade route, and no possible way to hear any of the stories we've already heard. The Popol Vuh, the sacred story of the Quiche Maya of highland Guatemala, describes an earlier tribe by the gods to make humans out of wood. Those wooden people couldn't think and couldn't remember their makers, so the sky god sends a flood down on them, plus a black rain and a revolt by their own animals and household objects. The few who survive, twisted and smaller, become, according to the story, the monkeys we have today. Let's say the obvious part out loud. The Quiche Maya did not get this story from Mesopotamia. There was no ship, no trade route, no shared language, no chain of people passing it across an ocean, and about 10,000 years of separate history. And yet, the shape is still there. A warning, a boat, or something like one. Almost everyone dies, and then a new start. Something is creating this pattern that has nothing to do with one story spreading from person to person. So if it isn't copying, what is it? Researchers who study this seriously point to two explanations, and the honest answer is that both are probably true at the same time for different parts of the pattern. The first is simple once you hear it. A flood is the most obvious disaster almost any ancient people could imagine. If you live near a river, you watch it flood every year, sometimes badly enough to threaten everything you know. If you live on a coast, you already know what happens when the sea comes farther inland than it should. You don't need to hear about Mesopotamia to picture the worst version of the disaster you already fear most. Every river valley and coastal culture on Earth has the raw material to invent this nightmare on their own, which means every one of them can invent a story about surviving it with nobody's help. The second explanation is geological, and this is where it gets stranger. There is real physical evidence that global sea levels rose by about 120 meters between 18,000 and 7,000 years ago, as the last ice age ended and the glaciers melted. One specific idea, the Black Sea Deluge hypothesis, says a sudden rush of Mediterranean seawater
poured into what had been a freshwater lake around 6,800 to 5,600 BCE. That's not myth, that's measured sediment data. And here's the part that should really get you. Researchers looking at Aboriginal Australian oral traditions have found more than 20 different coastal stories from all around the continent that describe a time when the coastline went much farther out to sea than it does now. When they calculated the minimum water depth each story would need to be literally true, the dates match real post-Ice Age sea level data, in some cases going back over 12,000 years. These aren't vague flood legends. They are specific, checkable claims about geography, naming islands that no longer exist by their original names, carried accurately, without writing, for about 500 generations. So here's the honest, not quite satisfying, and much more interesting truth. A real ancient flood event may well be the seed of some of these stories, a genuine memory, kept and passed on with surprising accuracy. And the simple fact that the flood is the ultimate disaster is why the pattern kept getting invented independently everywhere else, even in places with no real event behind it. Both things can be true. Neither one needs a lost global civilization. Now, let's deal with this head-on, because if you've spent any time in this part of the internet, you already know where this evidence usually goes next. The ancient astronaut argument looks at the exact same facts we just walked through, the same story showing up in places with no contact, and draws one conclusion. This sameness is best explained by a shared outside source. A single advanced teacher or a single lost civilization giving the same knowledge to disconnected cultures around the world, who then turned it into myth because they had no better way to describe it. It's a neat explanation. It's also not needed because everything we just showed you already explains the same evidence without it. Independent invention, driven by a fear every human shares that needs no outside teacher, plus, in at least some cases, a real and separately proven geological event that different cultures could each have lived through on their own coastlines without talking to each other. Between those two, every part of the same story everywhere observation is already accounted for. That's really the whole disagreement when you take the drama away. It's not that one side has evidence and the other doesn't. It's that one explanation requires inventing an unproven outside teacher nobody can name, and the other only requires things we already know are true. Rivers flood, seas rise, and the human mind is very good at building a story out of its worst fear. When two explanations cover the same facts, the one that doesn't need a brand new undiscovered cause is the one you should reach for first. The flood story isn't proof of one lost global civilization, and it isn't proof of an ancient teacher no one can name. It's proof of something almost more remarkable. Give human beings anywhere on Earth the same fear and sometimes the same real geological event, and they will independently build the same story to make sense of what happened to them. Mesopotamia didn't teach this to the Maya. Nobody had to. The story was always going to show up because the fear that creates it is universal, and in at least some parts of the world, so was the flood. If that idea grabs you, this exact pattern, the same story built independently out of the same raw human material, shows up everywhere else we look. Trickster gods who break the world so they can remake it. Journeys to the underworld that follow the same rules in every culture that's ever imagined. We're going to trace every one of them side by side with proper sources, no extra mysteries added. Subscribe and come trace the next one with us.